Happy Valentine's Day, and I hope that you're having a great week. We're now in week 7 of the quarter and definitely moving right along. So I want to use today's video to get into some of the new stuff for this week on the relationship between listening and race. I've structured this week as a way of providing you with some of the fundamental information and things that you can use to help to figure out and understand some core elements of this week's reading. So our goals are to understand some of the ways that listening is able to connect issues surrounding race, issues of context in terms that relate to race in the listening process, and how listening is shaped by issues including race too. So this week's reading is an article that comes from Robert Redding Jr. And interestingly, Robert Redding Jr. is a nationally syndicated talk show host, professor, and author. So comes from a really big background in radio production, and so on. And so is approaching this topic of listening from a really extensive background in media studies and engagement of media and related issues. And comes into this week reading really concerned with the ways that mediated communication or communication using media such as radio and other channels is related to things such as race and identity and some of the ways that they impact the listening process. As we think about it, race is definitely a challenging and difficult topic. We've seen over the last few years a lot of difficult and socially and politically charged discussions surrounding the issue. We've also seen with even some recent events, such as the halftime show at the Super Bowl last night, that there's a lot of issues of race, identity, and so on that continue to be discussed and to be dealt with. I think that it's important when we're approaching these issues to think about it from the perspective of learning. What can we gain and reflect on and think about as we engage in that process? As somebody that's white myself, I take the position that there is more that I can learn and better do to understand and engage with experiences other than my own. And I encourage folks to do the same. This week's reading is a little bit interesting because it's a case study that's examining the history of Black radio in the United States, and particularly the ways that Black-owned radio deals with institutional challenges and problems related to the listening process. So this week's reading is called Black Voices Right Power, Members of the Black Press Make Meaning of Media Hegemony. And this is a reading that engages with what it means to be a Black radio station that might be owned by a production company that's primarily comprised of folks that are white. And so the overall thesis and takeaway from this week's reading is that while perspectives of diverse and underrepresented voices are crucial and important, that the role of institutional power and leadership and organization really shapes the ways that members of that group can participate. That things such as radio are an opportunity for enclaves and populations to listen in a very focused way. And it's also important for us to think about the ways that media and our ability to understand and engage with media is shaped by other institutional factors. A core idea here, and one that gets brought up throughout this week's article, is the concept of Afrocentrism. Afrocentrism is a perspective that emerged over the last several decades that deals with the idea of centering the perspectives and experiences of African or Black cultures in a way that might not necessarily be known or understood. For instance, Dr. Arthur Carter, who's in many ways engaged with this practice, brings up the point that in studying the history and genealogy, for instance, the ancient history of Egyptians, that there is not necessarily as much discussion on the role of race, or when we think about a lot of other historical or challenging issues, that it's not a topic that's come up. When we think about issues of curriculum, for instance, textbooks in schools, what curriculum should or shouldn't be taught, one of the major areas of controversy is the degree to which perspectives from historically underrepresented populations are or are not included. So Afrocentrism is a way of centering or situating experiences of African or Black cultures that might not necessarily be a part of the discussion or included otherwise. Another core idea that gets talked about in the reading for this week is the idea of hegemony. And if you've taken a course or class in issues surrounding international relations, you might be familiar with this term. Pictured here on the right, you have this sort of understanding of the United States as a cultural hegemon. That's something that, especially following World War II, Cold War, and even to some extent in the contemporary era, the United States has been seen as occupying a sort of dominant role internationally in terms of military presence and spending, the presence of nuclear weapons, and so on. And while we can certainly think about hegemony in that way, in terms of the level of national power or influence, it's also useful to think about hegemony in a cultural sense. To give you one example, if you think about the prominence of films and TV shows, there's a good chance that very kind of ubiquitously, Disney comes to mind. For instance, Disney has been responsible for most of the top grossing films that are currently in theaters, and many of the most popular TV shows as well, such as the recent Book of Boba Fett TV show and a few others. So hegemony has a sort of cultural lens through this example, because we see that companies like Disney have this level of control and power over the media that we see in our lives. Similarly, we can think about hegemony when it comes to culture. What cultures are represented, included, or situated in the discussion? So when there's a discussion of a dominant or overarching hegemony in the United States, that might be seen in the context of race. This article is critiquing the ways that power is not necessarily felt evenly among populations that might be historically excluded from the ability to participate. In this way, the opportunity for things like enclaves or specific locations in which people communicate becomes really important and is a useful consideration to sort of counteract the broader cultural hegemony that might be happening. Additionally, this week's reading draws from historical accounts and understandings of meaning. For instance, the idea of this sort of troubadour historian role that actually emerged out of West Africa is a really unique one that has relevance and application to the article. For instance, the idea of sharing meaning, of sharing lived experiences and telling one's perspective to the world is this idea that becomes developed historically and used in a more contemporary context. So the application of unique language to describe words and issues is another really important and relevant idea. The last major thing that I think is really important to know for added context and understanding of this week's reading is the importance of radio and storytelling, and particularly in its relationship to race. For this week's reading, I am going to ask you to do as an activity looking into a little bit more surrounding history and context of race, and specifically the ways that enclaves and populations have developed to convey and share information. For instance, Black-owned radio stations, including in the 1950s and times of segregation, were incredibly important and popular to Black communities throughout the United States. And while they might not be as popular or have as much attention, still occupy really important roles in communication and shaping our understanding of current events and issues. So I think this is sort of an important thing to use as context and in thinking about this week's reading and the challenges that come up as we examine race and listening in a broader sense. So to wrap up for this week, we talked a little bit about some of the relationships between race and media, the relationships of history and context in shaping our understanding, and also the influence and role that media can play surrounding this. So I think this helps to equip you with what you need to know for a lot of dealing with the prompts and quiz for this week. For next week, we will be looking at space and place, thinking about how location and physicality can play a really big role in how we listen and engage with one another. Have a great rest of your week, and best of luck as you're continuing through the quarter. I hope that you enjoy your Valentine's Day, and I will talk to you again in next week's video. Have a good afternoon.